It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. The partnership between George Bush and Dick Cheney was by most accounts the most powerful White House duo since Nixon and Kissinger. During their administration, the United States faced a combination of unexpectedly grave crises and challenges on a scale arguably no president had confronted since John F. Kennedy went to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The events of the Bush-Cheney years still haunt the nation. Devastating terror attacks of 9/11, fighting in Afghanistan, the invasion and quagmire in Iraq, the disastrous response to Hurricane Katrina, and finally, the financial collapse and near depression of 2008. The Bush-Cheney years also gave rise to still deeply controversial counterterrorism policies, the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program, torture of detainees, Guantanamo Bay, and the use of drones to assassinate enemies. Most of a decade later, that administration remains one of the most unpopular in modern times. Yet now begins the slow process that will no doubt continue for years to come of re-evaluating the Bush presidency, and in particular, the relationship between George Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney. Joining us today is journalist Peter Baker, author of Days of Fire, his account of the Bush and Cheney White House. He is chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a regular panelist on Washington Week on PBS. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In Days of Fire, which I think really is the first serious effort to begin to write a history, a somewhat detached and comprehensive history of the Bush-Cheney years in the White House. And you, in my reading of the book, you split some middle ground between being a journalist and a historian in this effort to create that account. And in the end, you focus on this relationship between these two figures, but you also resist the standard impression of the Cheney-Bush relationship as being one in which Cheney was something of a puppet master behind Bush as president. Yeah. How did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think what we discover when you go back and re-examine this administration, very interesting, very consequential, very eventful, tumultuous. You mentioned some of the events, the Days of Fire, to use the conceit of the title, that dominated this 8 years. And you discover that the story is, as we thought we knew it, isn't quite right. That in fact it's more surprising than we had understood. The relationship between these two men we had always pictured as being one of often over-caricatured as Cheney being the puppet master, as you said, and Bush somehow being the puppet. Never actually the case, always an exaggeration, stick figure idea of things that was popular on late night television, but underestimated both Bush and also underestimated how much their relationship evolved over time. If in fact Cheney was obviously very influential, particularly in the early years, that changes over the course of the 8 years, so that the two diverge dramatically. By the end, they're fighting on almost every topic.
Well, and we'll work our way through those periods of that administration and that relationship. But take us back to the beginning of the two men, Bush and Cheney. How did they first come to know each other? Why does it come to pass that Cheney is the vice presidential selection?
Yeah, it's a great question. Nobody seems to remember exactly when they first met, but the research I did pins the likeliest date to be day in June of 1987. George W. Bush is helping his father run for president. He's assigned to go to the Hill and begin to court Republican congressmen up there. He's got 4 to visit that day. One of them is a low-key congressman from Wyoming named Dick Cheney. And as far as anybody can remember about that meeting, they got along well. But Cheney didn't exactly give him an endorsement for his father. He was moving up the ranks of the Republican leadership, didn't want to get involved in a Republican fight for the presidential nomination. His friend Don Rumsfeld also running at the time. So fast forward to 1992, Dick Cheney at this point is his father's defense secretary. George W. Bush thinks that Dan Quayle ought to be replaced on his father's re-election ticket, and he suggests a name to him, Dick Cheney. His father obviously doesn't go along with that, but the younger Bush later jokes that he obviously always had a Bush-Cheney ticket on his mind. So in 2000 comes along, he sends his aide, Joe Alba, to go meet with Dick Cheney and ask him if he'll be his vice president. Cheney says no. But he does agree to head the search committee, and that obviously leads to where we understand that it went.
What did Cheney think of young George Bush?
Well, I think he didn't know what to think too much of him. I think young George Bush hadn't had a lot of seasoning the way Dick Cheney did. Dick Cheney, by this point in his life, had been White House Chief of Staff and a 10-year congressman and defense secretary, member of the Intelligence Committee. W. Bush gets a later start in life, obviously. He struggles as a young man with alcohol, finally conquers that at age 40. At one point in his life, he says, I'm all hat and no money, you know, I'm all name and no money, basically. Finally gets some success with the Texas Rangers, parlays that to the Texas governorship. So I think Cheney understood that Bush was not seasoned enough on Washington issues and that he could play a role in helping him out.
And from the very beginning of the presidency, there's concern on the part of Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and others about the nature of that relationship. Well,
Cheney, of course, understood how power worked. And on occasion, when he felt the process wasn't working the way he wanted it to, he outmaneuvered his rivals like Condi Rice and Colin Powell. He sometimes went directly to the president on key decisions they felt left out, and that did cause some alienation inside the White House. It was a fractious team in that first term, particularly between Powell on the one side and Rumsfeld and Cheney on the other.
And there's a debate. You mentioned the recount of the disputed election of 2000. There's a conversation in the White House that you don't make a big deal of in the book, but it's very interesting, of where the president has come out after the recount and after it's finally gone his way, made some conciliatory remarks about bringing the nation back together again. But then there's this discussion in the White House about whether swing voters really do matter and whether the election really should drive the administration to the center. But what happens there, and what's the consequence of where that conversation goes?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Matt Dowd, who was one of his election strategists, goes back to study elections going back several decades, and he discovers that the people who call themselves independents are generally not as independent as they really are. They tend to still vote mostly Republican or mostly Democrat. And if you factor them out, then what you discover is that the number of people, the percentage of Americans who are genuinely swing voters, had shrunk from about 27%, my numbers may be slightly off, I think 27% down to 6% by the time President Bush won office in 2000. And what that meant was that you no longer had to necessarily focus your entire campaign on the middle, on reaching out to these middle voters, these swing voters. And in fact, you could do just as well by appealing to the base, by upping the turnout of the people who were already committed to you on the right or the left, depending on your point of view, because the 6% in the middle might not be as decisive as the 27% once were.
And so the upshot of that is that Bush's initial instinct of perhaps of the compassionate conservative, or some of this symbolism that seemed to be amenable to a broader spectrum of politics, in the end, that's not where the direction that the administration goes.
Well, it becomes less of a focus of it. Yeah, I think he still believed in a lot of those issues. He does try for a number. Some of them he succeeds, some of them he tries for and doesn't. But obviously the political imperative at that point is to think about how to make sure you keep your base happy, make sure that by 2004 you'll be appealing to them. That's Karl Rove's job in the White House, and it does change the way you govern. And the president decided coming out of the recount that he wasn't going to compromise on his big priorities, that he wasn't going to act as if he had lost the popular vote, which he had. You had to act like a mandate to have a mandate. And they argued that John Kennedy did the same thing in 1960 when he won with a razor-thin margin.
That episode, though, struck me as quite interesting, just in terms of the notion that here we are now, 12 years later, and this concept of not feeling a need to govern toward the center and a total focus on mobilization of the base on both ends of the political spectrum is at the core of the political paralysis, it would seem, that we have now. But was that is there some connectivity between that moment and this moment?
I think you see the roots of today in that moment and in the whole Bush presidency. Just taking an example of the Tea Party, we talk about a lot the Tea Party rise in American politics, and in some ways that's a reaction to Bush as much as it is a reaction to Obama. It's a reaction on the part of many conservatives who didn't like what they saw in Bush because he was in fact to some extent a big government conservative rather than a small government conservative. He expanded government. in terms of Medicare covering pharmaceutical drugs, in terms of the Homeland Security Department and the reach of the surveillance state. A lot of these things that irritated part of that section of the body politic began during his years, and so I think today's political situation does have its roots in that era.
Yeah, it's interesting to imagine what particularly given that a war and a period of great national crisis is the opportunity for a president to forge consensus, and those become these moments over history that alter the primary course of the sequence of history oftentimes.
Right.
And it's interesting, I think, that in the end we have this great period of war and national controversy and trauma that we come out of as divided, or more divided really than we were going into it. One wonders how it might have played out differently.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. He comes, he has the bullhorn moment on the pile of rubble at ground zero. I hear you, we all hear you. The people who knock buildings down will all hear all of us. And it's a moment of rallying unity in the country, and he skyrockets at 90% in the polls. That obviously dissipates pretty quickly. Some of it dissipates because that's our political system today. Some of it dissipates because of decisions he made. Obviously, Iraq becomes a very polarizing decision in America. And people say that he took the goodwill he did have on the part of the country and spent it down with Iraq in a way that didn't help him. He's asked one time after leaving office, a former aide goes to visit him in Dallas, asks some pretty cheeky question, I think. He says, well, what was it like leaving office as the most unpopular president in modern times? And he said, I was also the most popular president. And I think that dichotomy is true. He's at different points, at both ends of those numbers. We tend to remember our former presidents a little more fondly than we do in the moment. The passions fade. We think of the things that worked out and are a little bit more forgiving of the things that didn't. So his numbers today, his favorability number is 49% versus 46% unfavorable. Obviously, that's not a great range, but it's the first positive balance he's had in 8 years. And I think that's because, some conservatives who were alienated by his policies have now come home to him because Obama is worse as far as they're concerned. I think some liberals and moderates are a little bit more fond of him because he's not a Tea Party Republican, because in fact he would have done a deal on immigration if he could, because he cared about AIDS in Africa, because he doesn't come across, he didn't shut the government down and wouldn't have if he could have. So, it's an interesting moment for him. He was on the Tonight Show last night. He's enjoying sort of a period of relative reassessment.
So let's talk about some specific key elements of this administration, and then we'll get into the Bush and Cheney relationship. And some of this is ground that's been covered before in various ways. The revelations over time about the lead up to 9/11, whether the administration had warnings and such, when the interest in Iraq began and how that affected things. But tell us the summary of how you view all of that. What was the Bush administration's focus in terms of national security and these questions when it came into office, and how did that change over those first 8 months?
Right. Well, it came into office, it didn't really have its eye, this administration, on terrorism as its single focus. The president had mentioned it as a candidate, as an issue. It certainly was on the radar screen, but top of the list was Saddam Hussein. Obviously, many of the people in the administration had been personally involved through the previous Bush administration. Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, folks like Donald Rumsfeld had been involved in the movement during the 90s, pushing for regime change. We were still enforcing these no-fly zones over Iraq. So in effect, we were sort of in this low-scale, low kind of tier war already with Iraq when they come into office. And so I think it's on their minds. And I think that the idea of a regime change, which was the policy of the country, President Clinton had signed it into law, but I think they were more determined to make it happen. Now, some people argued they were always determined to go to war. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that they thought the public was interested in sending hundreds of thousands of troops to Iraq prior to 9/11. In fact, in July of 2001, Don Rumsfeld sends a memo saying we need to rethink this Iraq policy. It's not working. We might even want to include military options, and no one even answers him. So Iraq is on their mind. Iraq is certainly, in their view, the main enemy of the day. But 9/11 begins to change the equation about how you respond to it, what you do about it.
Let's back up a little bit before we get to 9/11. When the administration begins, essentially no one has ever heard of Al-Qaeda. No one in the administration except some national security staff. Is it Richard Clark who spells it Al-Qaeda, Q-I-D-A, at that stage of things. He's the one voice, and you largely accept his account. I think his account of things seems persuasive to you, that he begins to knock on the door fairly early, saying we need to look at this. No one's quite hearing that. Condoleezza Rice seems to largely agree with that. But tell us that sequence of events. What were just remind us, even though we've heard much of this before, remind us, what were the blinking red lights?
Right. No, exactly. There were obviously a number of moments. From the beginning, Richard Clark was a holder from the Clinton administration, counterterrorism official, and he tried to impress upon them, as he saw it, how perilous, how dangerous Al-Qaeda really was to the country. He would send memos, he would have meetings, and he felt frustrated that he couldn't get their attention. It was a slow process for a new administration coming in fresh, trying to build its staff. I mean, it's a hard thing for a new administration to take on these issues, but it was a slow process. They didn't get around to really studying what to do about Afghanistan, what to do about terrorism, until literally the days in advance of 9/11 in September of 2001. There are moments through the spring and summer when the intelligence agencies are picking up what they call chatter, indications that something big might be afoot. At one point in July 2001, George Tenet says, he's a CIA chief, says he has this hair-raising briefing from his staff and rushes to the White House to tell Condoleezza Rice that something big might happen in the next few weeks, and the country should be on a war footing. And then, of course, in August of 2001, the president is given a briefing, a memo that we all know today called Bin Laden Determined to Strike U.S., all of which were the blinking red lights that were later described for the 9/11 Commission, none of which actually triggered the kind of action that was required, obviously, to stop 9/11. And I think that's, it's sort of a failure of imagination. I think that, they didn't see clearly what was coming. And in truth, the intelligence was vague at times. What was presented to the president in that briefing, for instance, in that August PDB, I went back and reread it. It's a page and a half. The first page is all this sort of like, Bin Laden told ABC News 3 years ago he wants to hit America. Okay, well, that's not really very helpful in terms of understanding what's happening. The second page has a couple really provocative sentences about interest in federal buildings and the possibility that people might be in the country, but that's all it says. It doesn't give any more, what they call actionable intelligence. And the president, is told that there are dozens of FBI investigations going on, so he clearly thinks that's acceptable. And when he gets back to town in September, George Tenet doesn't bring it up in his daily briefings in the week leading up to 9/11. So there's this kind of, complacency. The president later said, my blood wasn't boiling. I didn't, in effect, see what was coming.
And then there is this meeting just before 9/11 where Connie Rice pulls together or presides over. That is the first meeting specifically to discuss doing something about Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda.
Right, exactly. And there's been this blue sky plan, that's what the CIA called it, to go after terrorism, which included arming people who were helpful to us and using drones not for armed conflict at that point, but for surveillance and so on. And it's just too late, obviously. At this point, Mohammed Atta and his friends are already in the country with boarding passes and box cutters.
So we get to the events of 9/11, the day of, and you give a very compelling, multi-dimensional account of that. The infamous reading of the GOAT story at the elementary school in Florida. But in the end, that 24, 36-hour period ends up with two very contradictory perceptions of that. The president scores a tremendous public relations victory and really inspires the nation with his unexpected impromptu visit to New York, to the scene of Ground Zero. But that initial response, both when he gets the word, and in fact, as you describe it, he's actually told about the first plane before he goes into the classroom, then about the second when he continues to read, frustrates his staff, then does a shaky performance on camera after. It was a bad initial set of hours. But tell us the story of that day and why you think those events came to be perceived so differently, and what do they really mean about the guy? What really was going on?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. He obviously, I think like many Americans, I think he was a little slow in perceiving just what had happened, right? The first plane he's told about, he thinks it's an accident like many Americans did. He's a former pilot himself, having been in the Texas Air National Guard, and he's thinking about the pilot must have had a heart attack, something like that, how terrible. He didn't obviously see it for what it was. Most people, I think, didn't after the first plane. The second plane hits. Andy Card, as chief of staff, comes onto the stage or into the classroom where he's reading with the kids and whispers in his ear, "America is under attack. The second tower has been hit." And you see, if you go back and look at the video, you see the sort of scrunched up look on his face, and he's kind of like in shock, right? And as many Americans would. And he takes 5 minutes with these kids reading My Pet Goat before he gets up and leaves. And that becomes...
Andy Card is at the back of the room and holds up a notepad that says, "Don't say anything yet."
Right, Art Fleischer holds up the notepad, exactly. He says, "Don't say anything yet." And, obviously that becomes very criticized, sitting there for 5 minutes, why doesn't he get up, doesn't he understand? And I think if you put yourself in the moment, obviously today no president would do that. It's much more on the tops of their minds. He has Bush always had a belief of not responding to things like, he wouldn't let, he believed in an orderly type of process, and getting up in the middle of a schoolroom would have seemed alarmist and panic people. And so I think his initial instinct was to be calm and try to get out of there, but not to jump up. Obviously, I think the country might have wanted him to jump up in hindsight. He's taken up Air Force One. They're told it races into the air 40,000 feet without a flight plan just to get him out of there because they're worried that he might be targeted. You don't know. And to the Secret Service, there's very few places in the world that are more safe than Air Force One. It's a flying fortress. So they put him in the air and then convince him that he needs to go someplace other than Washington because they think there's a threat on the plane, and they send him off to a couple air bases. That doesn't look good for him. It doesn't seem decisive. He's frustrated all day long. He's angsting about this. I should be back in Washington. Why aren't I there? And he comes back finally at the end of the day and gives this Oval Office address that some of his speechwriters call the awful office address. They didn't like it very much. And it takes a couple of days till he gets his feet grounded, and he does sort of have this sort of bravura performance on the rubble at Ground 11 on September 14th, where his sort of spontaneous reaction to the people who are calling out, "We can't hear you, we can't hear you," captures, becomes one of the indelible moments of that presidency, right?
And ironically, while all that's happening, Cheney is in fact being the rock. Yeah. He's in Washington. He's trying to take command. He says, yes, shoot down that remaining jet, which it turns out is already crashing by the time the order goes out. In fact, the order never really goes out. Right. But he tries to take command. He's being the strong figure, but he also circumvents the chain of command. Don Rumsfeld doesn't know that he's ordered that planes be shot down. But does Cheney operate as he should have in that period of time? And what's Bush's view of Cheney's behavior on that day afterwards?
Yeah, I think on that day, I think Bush was grateful to have Dick Cheney. In a way, it looked like his choice was prescient, right? In a moment of crisis, you needed somebody at your side who had the seasoning and the calm wherewithal to know what to do and to feel capable of doing it. One of his aides said that Cheney made the decision to order the shoot down of a possible hijacked plane in the space of time it takes a batter to swing at a ball. That's an awfully difficult decision. At least it seems like it would be to me. You're ordering the possible killing of hundreds of innocent Americans. And I asked him about that during one of our interviews. I said, well, is that a hard decision? He says, I don't want to sound callous. I don't want to sound, heartless. But it wasn't a hard decision. To him, it was a clear-cut calculation of risks, This is terrible, but them hitting the Capitol, the White House, and thousands of people on the ground dying is more terrible. And so, in that space of time, you needed somebody who was able, I suppose, to make a decision like that without angsting. It didn't necessarily, though, show off President Bush as the leader. I think there was some concern about that among his staff. In fact, Cheney suggests that Karen Hughes go out and give a press conference because he knows that if he goes out, it'll look like he's, in charge and fuel this idea that, in fact, he's really the power behind the throne. So there's real sensitivity about that at that time.
And there's sensitivity about it by Cheney.
Including.
He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be seen this way. He doesn't want to say, it's not an I'm in charge moment.
Exactly. He does not do what Al Haig did during the Reagan assassination attempt. And he's smart enough to have understood that that would be a mistake politically as well as public relations-wise.
So let's fast forward through the events that follow the next few weeks, and we get to the obvious necessity of doing something in Afghanistan, attacking al-Qaeda. It's clear right off the bat that al-Qaeda is involved in this. And so we have the special forces who land, the sequence of events there. Osama bin Laden is forced to Tora Bora. We all begin to hear reports in America that he's hunkered down in the mountains and these 500-pound bombs dropping on him and the end may be near. And then there's a line in the book where you say in just a few words, while bin Laden is escaping in the mountains, Bush and Cheney were focusing on Iraq.
Yeah.
And so within a very short time, in fact, bin Laden is gone, and the story begins to turn dramatically.
Right.
But does that sentence sort of sum up, not your entire book, but a very large portion of your book?
Well, it sums up a strategic choice that they made, right? To begin thinking about Iraq before they had really gotten Afghanistan under control and they had captured the people who were directly responsible for 9/11. I think they thought they had Afghanistan under control and that it was possible to begin thinking about other things safely and that they would get bin Laden one way or the other. If they had imagined at that time that it would take, 10 more years to get him, it probably would look differently. But they were told, Hank Crumpton, who was a top intel guy, comes to the White House and says he's going to get away. We need to do something about it. James Mattis was a Marine general. He said, let me bring my troops up to the Tora Bora and then try to seal the border. Now, my wife was at Tora Bora as a reporter, and I have to say, it's a very porous, mountainous, rugged area. No amount of troops could have sealed that border. But we had also subcontracted, in effect, the battle there to local warlords who were busy fleecing us for money and betraying us behind our backs. And we lost bin Laden as a result. And I think that, clearly, over time, there was some regret about that.
But meanwhile, the movement toward Iraq is now well underway and
Right.
accelerates quickly. And at that stage, Bush and Cheney are largely in lockstep in the approach to all of that, but there begin to be doubts from some of the other members of the administration.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. They are moving toward Iraq. People say Cheney made Bush invade Iraq. I don't think that's true. I think Bush had Iraq on the mind as well. Richard Clark tells a story that Bush doesn't necessarily confirm and says, I don't think that's true, but something like it might be true, in which shortly after 9/11, Bush is in the Situation Room kind of wandering through and says to Clark, I want you to find out if Iraq was involved. And Clark says, well, we know it's bin Laden. He says, yes, but I want you to check and make sure that Iraq's not involved. So even from the beginning, they have Iraq on their mind. Now, it seems to me that it doesn't seem that unreasonable to ask to make sure Iraq isn't involved. What becomes problematic for them is that it takes them a long time to be convinced when the intel comes back negative. Cheney particularly seizes on this idea that Iraq had sent an agent to meet with Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers in Prague, long after the intel agencies disputed and ultimately disproved that existence of that meeting. So, but Iraq is quickly comes up in debate at Camp David the weekend after 9/11. At that point, Bush and Cheney said, no, we're not going to do that right now. We got to focus. But within a few weeks, Bush is already talking to Rumsfeld about the war plan. By December in Tora Bora, they're meeting about the war plan, and they're moving forward. And, a senior official told me, and it's in the book, that he says, look, I think tell people today the reason we went into Iraq was because we needed to kick somebody's posterior, and Afghanistan was too easy. And by that he means it's a pretty cynical thing to say. I think what he means, though, is that the atmosphere in the White House at the time and in the country at large was an extraordinary period of angst and uncertainty and fear and anger and appetite for action. And knocking off some Taliban guys in plastic sandals from Kabul didn't seem to be enough in response to what had happened. And so we went out looking for dragons to slay, to use John Quincy Adams' phrase. And the biggest dragon that they saw was Saddam Hussein.
And in that period of time, this fairly, particularly in hindsight, this somewhat uninterrupted march toward the inevitable, really. It didn't seem quite as inevitable at the time, but this begins to unfold over the months. You don't talk a lot about the media in the book. I mean, you have reference points of media coverage, but you don't really go deeply into the Judith Miller episode or the role of particular news organizations. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that, particularly since you're not at the White House, you're not in that equation at the time. In hindsight, it would appear both that there is this dereliction really might be the word in terms of, on the government side, in terms of a coherent analysis of the intelligence and what it really meant, and an equal kind of dereliction perhaps on the media side in terms of being the questioners of the deciders.
Right.
But
Yeah.
what's your view on that?
Yeah, I was overseas and not at the New York Times at the time, and I don't know Judith Miller and wouldn't want to comment specifically about her. I do think that there was a case in both the government and the media. I'm not a scholar, but it seemed like a perfect case of confirmation bias, right? Everybody believed Hussein had weapons because he had weapons. He had used them in the past. And so when intelligence came in saying he had weapons, everybody was predisposed to believe it. And then when there were doubts, when there were dissents, they were predisposed to dismiss the dissents or dismiss the doubts or overlook them, right? Now, there were people who waved their hands and tried to make the case. This is not right, guys. But often they were making the case about specific elements of the intelligence, not necessarily all of the intelligence. There are a lot of people out there who say, this part of the intelligence was wrong or that part of the intelligence was wrong. There weren't too many agencies or people in the agency saying all of it was wrong. So did the media then perpetuate this misunderstanding? Yes, absolutely. Obviously, we played up the stories that confirmed what we thought was true and that the government was telling us about, and we played down the stories that we should have given more play. That included the doubts, included the caveats and the what-ifs. And I think that those are lessons that we've learned over time painfully, that it's our job to be as skeptical as we can. Having said that, there are limits to what reporters can do. We are hostage to our sources to some extent. We don't have the spy satellites. We don't have, subpoena power. We don't have international agencies. We don't have, we are reliant on the people who do have access to that type of intelligence and information, and we need to question them and be skeptical of them. But people say you should have proved that he didn't have it. I don't know how we would have done that, honestly.
So you recount the key elements of a particular episode that I think is remarkable. I think the date's September the 8th, 2002, where the White House essentially leaks an element of this
Yes.
intelligence about Iraq obtaining these aluminum pipes necessary for weaponization, creating nuclear weapons, leaks this information to the New York Times. The New York Times then publishes an account as if this is something that the Times has dug up, and then that appears in a Sunday paper, and then that same Sunday, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell are on the Sunday news shows and begin citing this New York Times account as confirmation of the
Right.
of the reasonableness of
Very
going
circular.
to war. Very
Exactly.
circular.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, a real betrayal of the readers, that where in that case you've got the news organization knows exactly what has happened, that this is a leaked piece of information, and that is part of a march toward war, and doesn't reveal that the real source of this or the fairly overt intentions of leaking this information. I'm curious what you think about that in hindsight now. I am. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? But also, is that something that could happen today? If the same sequence of events began with you, could it happen today?
Well, I think today we're obviously very cognizant of those lessons, and that we evaluate stories on intelligence in a different way today than we did probably then. Again, I wasn't at the New York Times and I was overseas, so I'm presuming to some extent. I know that when we write stories today about Iran's nuclear program, there's a lot of scrutiny about those stories. Why do we think this is true? Where do we think this comes from? And so on. We're a lot less likely, I think, to believe, defectors, which is obviously something that had been wrong in the Iraq case. Having said that, you also have to be careful not to overcompensate for past mistakes the other direction, right? So, in the Iran case, for instance, everybody says, well, it's just the same thing as Iraq. Well, it's not necessarily the same thing as Iraq. In this case, you have the IAEA, the UN body that does these kinds of things, deeply involved. Their experts are making this case, and so on. So I think we have to be careful to be too locked into our feelings of regret about mistakes in the past, learn the lessons from it, and then evaluate in today's context.
And you also have that the current administration has stuck with many of the fundamental approaches of the Bush administration, something that's lost on both the opposition and in favor of parts of the equation around that. But in terms of the warrantless wiretapping, the use of drones, the continuation of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan for a long period of time, and the basic idea that the U.S. couldn't just presumptuously pull out, precipitously pull out. But the Obama administration has continued many of these policies in a sort of compromising way, and now finds itself as criticized as much by the other side.
Yeah, I think the way I put it often is Obama runs against Bush's first term, but inherits Bush's second term. And by that I mean that by the time Bush has left office, he has had made changes because he wants his program to be sustainable after he leaves office, because the courts are on his case, because Congress and the media are on his case. So there's been no waterboarding since after 2003. He closes the black site CIA prisons around the world.
But many more drone assassinations and killings.
He still does. He begins the drone program that Obama continues. But my point is that he goes to Congress and gets buy-in on the surveillance program. He goes to Congress to get buy-in on military commissions. He actually pulls more people out of Guantanamo than Obama has in the 5 years since, because he says, okay, we ought to begin thinking about closing Guantanamo. So he comes up with a 3-year withdrawal plan from Iraq that he signs and leaves for Obama. So the harshest edges of his program had been modified and gotten buy-in by both parties to some extent by the time he leaves office, so that Obama, rather than being a radical change, makes further modifications. But he had voted for some of this stuff now as a senator. And so, as you say, the drone strikes become even more expanded. The surveillance continues and in some ways is expanded. You see a little bit more of a bipartisan support for these programs and a bipartisan criticism, where you see parts of the left now meeting parts of the right coming together and say, wait a second, this is too far.
So now back in the story of the administration, we get deeper into that second term, and it comes to pass at a certain point, tell us when that was exactly, that President Bush, by your accounting, has, not completely, but in a very consequential way, has lost confidence in Cheney, or has changed significantly in the way that he views Cheney. Is that the case, that he loses faith in Cheney in some respect, and how does that happen? Well,
I think he begins to want to move in a different direction. I think that Iraq has gone badly. There are no weapons there. He's looking at a second term with this messy war that hasn't been what he thought it was going to be. And he begins thinking, what can I do to make this presidency go the direction I want? And he begins turning to Condoleezza Rice. He makes her, gives her Secretary of State. He elevates her in his circle of advisors. And he begins pushing more on diplomacy when it comes to North Korea, Iran, Syria. He does, in fact, make these compromises we're talking about in terms of some of the terrorism programs, all of which Cheney resists and finds disturbing. He thinks these are signs of going weak or losing will, that they're dangerous to the country to make these kind of compromises, that Bush is catering to the chattering class to some extent. And so they begin heading in different directions, particularly in the second term.
But is that a fair assessment? That loses confidence in, loses faith in, or is that too strong?
I don't think he would say it that way. I mean, that's ultimately the impact of it. He's no longer relying on Cheney the way he did. I asked Cheney about this. He said, look, it's not surprising that he would feel more confident in his own judgment by then and need staff less. It was interesting to use the word staff as if he, the vice president, was staff, but that's sort of the way he had sort of played it. But Bush clearly was not, as enamored with the approach that Cheney was advocating on so many different issues. I mean, the really dramatic contrast is these two moments of decision in 2003 and 2007. 2003, they're about to go into Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld and George Tenet come to the White House and say, we've got this intelligence saying we think we know where Saddam Hussein is. Let's have an early strike and try to get him. The president meets with his team. They talk about it, and he kicks everybody out except for Cheney. The one he wants to talk to alone, just the two of them, is Cheney before he makes this momentous decision. Comes out of that meeting, says, okay, go. The war in Iraq begins. Very fateful moment. 4 years later, flash forward to 2007, Israel comes to the White House and says, we have this intelligence saying that Syria has a nuclear facility, but we think it's part of a weapons program. It was helped constructed by the North Koreans, and we think you ought to bomb it. It's a threat. Bush gathers his team together. They have a meeting. What do we do about this? And this time, instead of kicking everybody else out, he asked Cheney what his point of view is in front of everybody else. Cheney says, I think we ought to bomb it. We've set red lines on proliferation. They have violated it. If we don't do this, our word will mean nothing. He's very consistent in his view about these types of things. Bush says, okay. He asks around the crowd. He says, who else agrees with the vice president? And no hands go up. So not only is the vice president now isolated in this team, the president has forced him to confront the isolation in front of them. It's no longer just the two of them in a room. And I think that contrast between those two meetings tells you a lot about the evolution of their partnership.
And how's Cheney reacting to that internally, emotionally?
I think he's very frustrated, very disappointed. He's a good soldier, doesn't say it publicly, but he feels the president's making the wrong decision on a lot of these things. And they're on opposite sides, really, on so many things by the second term. I mean, by the time they leave office, there are disagreement on North Korea, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Russia, climate change, gun rights, gay rights, the auto bailout, Harriet Miers, Donald Rumsfeld, and ultimately, of course, at the end, we'll get to it, I'm sure, but the pardon of Scooter Libby.
Yeah. And gay marriage becomes one of those trigger points, right? Where Cheney's daughter refuses to come to the second, to be in the gallery when for the president's address to full Congress at the beginning of the second term.
Yeah,
right?
It's really interesting today, given what's been happening with the Cheney family this week on the issue of same-sex marriage. But in 2004, the president is going to say in his State of the Union address that he is supportive of the sanctity of marriage, and by that he means not for gay marriage and not for courts intervening. And Mary Cheney, who's her father's campaign aide, reads the speech and is distraught. And there's a crisis moment in the family, rushes to the West Wing. What do we do? Lynn Cheney shows up. Liz Cheney rushes over so fast to be supportive of her sister. She's still wearing blue jeans, even though you're not supposed to wear them in the White House. So they have this meeting in the vice president's office, and they tell her, look, if you want to quit, we'll back you. You have to do what you have to do, and we're your family, and we're with you. And the vice president, after a long discussion, said, I got to go to this fundraiser in New York. So Mary Cheney gets on the plane with him. Lynn Cheney gets on the plane with him. They go to New York. He's doing the fundraiser in some wealthy person's apartment, and in the back room, in the kids' room, I think it is, Mary Cheney and Lynn Cheney are having this very pained discussion about what to do. And ultimately, she stays with the campaign, and even when he later announces his support, Bush announces his support for a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage, she stays. But you can see how much this is a painful point in that partnership, and Cheney is quite upset and later says publicly that he doesn't agree.
And so let's go to the story of Scooter Libby, this aide to Vice President Cheney, who ends up being convicted of a federal crime and receives a very serious sentence for having leaked information to a reporter related to the identity of Valerie Plame. We know that story relatively well. But in the end, Cheney believes that he has been gravely mistreated, that both Libby has been done wrong and the vice president has been done wrong. But tell us that story and then how that finally bears on their relationship at the end.
Right. Well, Libby had been very important to Cheney. He was his chief of staff and national security advisor, a dual role. So important to him, people called him Cheney's Cheney. And he was convicted. He was convicted not of the leak itself, but convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice for lying to federal prosecutors about how he learned that Valerie Plame Wilson was from the CIA. He said he learned about it from Tim Russert, the newsman, which therefore, if he had, meant he didn't compromise classified information because he got something from a public place. But 8 other people said that they had had conversations with him about this before he had talked with Russert. So President Bush did commute his sentence. He got a 2.5-year sentence in prison. President Bush thought that was too much. Scooter Libby did have to pay a $250,000 fine and lose his law license. And Cheney comes to President Bush at the end of the administration saying, okay, you're done. This is the time we give out pardons usually at the end of an administration. His father had done it, Bush's father. Clinton had done it, often very controversial in both cases. He thought that Libby should have one, that this was a political prosecution, a bogus prosecution, that it was really just a matter of differing memories, and that Fitzgerald, the prosecutor, was really after the vice president, and Libby had taken a bullet for him. But Bush was skeptical. Bush didn't like pardons to begin with. He saw them as kind of something where people with great access were able to get special favors that others couldn't get. So he'd actually been stingier about pardons than any president in a century except for his father. Didn't like to give them out. And he sent the White House lawyers, to go re-look at the Scooter Libby case, look at the trial transcripts. They met with Libby at a seafood restaurant near the White House, and they came back to him and said, well, look, we think the jury had every reason to find what it found. And the president said, okay, that's the decision then. And he tells the vice president in their final meeting, their final one-on-one lunch, and the vice president says to him, you're leaving a good man wounded on the field of battle, which is about as harsh a thing as Cheney had ever said to him, and it really aimed at Bush's own self-image as a loyal person to his people. And at that point, the friendship was fractured. Bush worried that it was permanently so. They, on inauguration, he dwelled about it at Camp David the last weekend of his in office. Laura Bush finally says to him, look, make up your mind, you're ruining this for everyone. 2 days later on Inauguration Day, he hasn't changed his mind, but he's still thinking about it. He gets into the car to go to the Capitol with President-elect Obama. And it's just the two of them in the Secret Service heading to the ceremony. And he offers one last piece of advice. He said, whatever you do, set a pardon policy early and stick to it. In other words, learn how to say no to your vice president. And it's fascinating that even then, in this last minutes of his presidency, with all he had been through, war and terrorism, natural disaster, financial crash, the thing on his mind was his rift with his partner, with his vice president, Dick Cheney.
How do you write a book like this, and when do you decide that you're going to write a book like this? You arrive at this White House well after many of these events. By the time you're deeply involved in it, many, many memoirs have been written, probably more memoirs about that administration than any administration in the past. In the end, you don't have access to President Bush himself, the core figure. So when was it that you began to frame this up in your mind? And was there a point in time that you said to yourself, if I can't get to Bush, I can't write this book? And then was there another point when you said, no, actually I can?
That's a good question. I came back to cover the White House in 2004. It was late in 2006, early 2007, I began thinking about a book. What I originally thought about doing was a book about the second term, because the second term had been so dramatic, so many things had happened. Iraq had gone so badly, Katrina, the shooting incident you mentioned, so many other pivotal moments. But as time went by and I switched jobs from the Washington Post to the New York Times, and the administration ended, I began thinking that maybe a book just about the second term was too limited, that we needed, in fact, something that covered the whole presidency, that tried to explain, understand what happened. You're right, President Bush didn't want to cooperate, so the idea of doing Bush and Cheney and looking at their partnership seemed more logical because Cheney did cooperate. And I think that any book that looked at the Bush presidency would have to address this relationship anyway. What was it? What did it add up to? So it's a narrative way of telling the story of those 8 years through these two fascinating characters and this remarkable and dynamic and almost Shakespearean relationship. And I did have a lot of access to, not to the president, but to most everybody else. About 275 people sat down with me, including Connie Rice and Don Rumsfeld and Colin Powell and David Petraeus and Steve Hadley and Mike Gerson and Josh Bolton and so on. And a lot of them gave me papers and notes and things that hadn't been released. And I think those memoirs are valuable because a lot of people aren't going to read a lot of them. I read them, so you don't have to.
But at the same time, as you're writing something like this, do you, and you don't mind a bit of a hard question, do you? You don't mind a little pushing, do you?
No, I'm looking for the hardest you got.
Good.
Bring it on, as somebody we know might have said.
Exactly. It seems to me there's such a pressure on a journalist now. I think we call you a historian as much in the context of a book like this, but there's such pressure to offer what is presented as a complete account. So, and yet there are many places, and I read the footnotes, and so there are places there's sequences of events where there's a visit where President Bush sends Colin Powell to Israel well, you'll remember the year, but right. Where Israel has troops in Palestine. There's a real crisis, this early point. And Powell goes over and meets with the Israeli Prime Minister. There's a debate at the White House about all of this interesting, complex sequence of events. But we go into the footnotes of it, and you clearly talk to Powell, and you can sort of feel that. And it looks like Powell's a persuasive character to you in many respects. But the rest of the story is drawn from memoirs in that part of it. But did you wrestle with whether on the pages there one should have said, by the way, reader, I never got to ask President Bush about this, and so I'm just going by this account. I mean, was there any obligation that you wondered about to acknowledge the complexity of telling the story without all the characters available to retell it to you?
Right. No, that's a good question. I do that in in a section in the back where I discuss the sourcing and the notes and so forth, and I make clear who talked and who didn't. The great thing about this project, one thing I found very gratifying, was in going back to almost all the people I interviewed, nearly all of them went on the record. like 95% of the people who I talked to were on the record in the end, and they are footnoted in the back. So it's not a book that relies on anonymous sources for the most part. We say straight up in the book that Bush didn't talk, but here are all the other people who did. I listed them in the book, so you know exactly who talked. And I think that it's not unlike what Doris Kearns Goodwin has done with her most recent book, or Scott Berg with his Wilson biography. I mean, I had the benefit of actually talking to people, at least, who were involved in those, and they had to rely entirely on memoirs and documents and notes from those era, and they footnote those properly in the backs of their books without trying to slow down the narrative too much. So there's a balance between making clear where you get your information, but also making sure that the reader is served in a narrative that moves along.
You had one footnote that really jumped out at me, and I don't actually remember what the content was, but it's a comment from Bush. It's that came from an off-the-record session with reporters at the White House. That you were not one of the reporters, but someone who was there. Made available to you or lost, and you found it in the copy machine. But somehow you came to hold the notes taken by another reporter who had agreed to confidentiality around this conversation with the president, and then you quoted the president through this indirect, what becomes a violation of the other reporter violated effectively, the off-the-record agreement. Is that a bit of dirty pool?
Well, that's a great question, and you're the only one who's picked up on that. Leave it to a journalist to notice that. My answer is no. I don't see the difference between getting notes from a journalist who was in there who had an agreement of confidentiality and getting it from a senator who went in to meet with the president and was presumed to be confidential meeting. All these memoirs discuss meetings that were presumed confidential at the time, and then people chose to make them public through their books or through their notes. Half the interviews that you do are with people who were in the room telling you about things that happened in the room where, in theory, they might not have, been expected to publicly reveal that later. So I don't think it's a difference because it was a journalist who was my source versus an official who was my source. If that journalist made whatever understanding he or she might make, I didn't have any obligation to respect somebody else's obligation any more than I did for Senator Warner if he went in, or what I'm saying, to go see the president and then told us afterwards what happened.
So in the end, a president should be judged by the most grave issues, crises that faced the nation during their period. In the end, George Bush largely destroyed Al-Qaeda. It did effectively counterattack those who had attacked the U.S. on 9/11. And at the end of his presidency, he probably prevented a far worse economic depression, perhaps a global economic catastrophe. In the end, whatever one thinks of him, he handled those two things defensively and probably very well. At the same time, he perhaps recklessly mismanaged the approach to the decision of whether or not to invade Iraq, and in the end, more Americans died as a result of that decision than as a result of the 9/11 attacks. So in the end, good president, bad president.
I'm going to give you the same answer I gave Colbert, definitely top 50. The great thing about this book is it tries to be neutral about two people nobody's neutral about. And my goal was to lay out what happened, to try to bring you in the room, to explain how they made the decisions, and then let the reader decide good president, bad president. I think there's, as you say, I think the tally sheet is complicated. There are, in fact, plenty of things to admire and plenty of things to criticize. What would he say today? If you go to his library, one of the things he puts out there as one of his major things that we don't talk about much is PEPFAR, right? This program saved millions of people from AIDS in Africa. It's the largest international effort to stop a single disease in the history of mankind. And most people don't know about that, right? They just reauthorized it this week in Congress because Iraq sucks so much of the oxygen out of the room, right? So many things he wanted to do in his second term were hobbled by Iraq and the consequence of the decision that he made. He wanted to do Social Security, he wanted to do immigration, he wanted to do tax reform in the second term. None of these things happened, at least in part, because of the political baggage that he had endure to that point. So yeah, I think you're right. I think he claims and can claim that he protected the country after 9/11, and on 9/12 we might have doubted that we could have gotten through 2 terms of Bush without another significant attack. He has programs on tax cuts and Medicare, No Child Left Behind, that he feels proud of. I think he feels strongly that he liberated the people of Iraq and Afghanistan from pretty tyrannical governments. Having said that, you know, as you point out, a lot of people died, and a lot of wreckage happened in those 2 countries that are great tragedies, and that we have a hard time, you know, processing today. So it's complicated. I think that's one of the things that makes this an interesting presidency, because it's not a clear-cut, you know, easy, defined administration, and we're going to be debating and redebating and reevaluating for years and decades to come. And I hope this is a first step.
Thank you.
Thank you.